on the video.
One more thing we have to do, the part that I've really been looking forward to, and that is there's one last question. That's the question that you get to pose to our next speaker. And I looked up who our next speaker would be. Now, maybe this question is a segue to your question, but our next speaker is your Dartmouth classmate and former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. So when he is sitting in that chair, what would you like him to have to answer?
Hank, I got two related questions for you. Number one, why in the Wall Street bailout did you not condition those funds on Wall Street doing several things that it needed to do, particularly with regard to mortgage mitigation and also making money available to Main Street through small regional banks, and also putting some constraints on lobbying by Wall Street firms, particularly during the period of time Congress was trying to reform the financial system. And secondly, Hank, after you explain all of that, I would like you to tell us whether the social benefits of Wall Street exceed the social costs. Thank you, Hank.
Yes. I'll tell you, some things in life never change. And those sounded like two questions rather than one. Now, I'm going to start with the first one and the second one and then go to the first one, because on the social benefits versus costs, I have a difference with Bob. I'm a capitalist, and I believe, I believe that we have the most prosperous country on earth, which has been for a good while, for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that we have world-class capital markets, and we've had world-class capital markets. And if we want to stay on top, and if we want to remain competitive, we're going to need strong capital markets. Now, why do we need strong capital markets? Jobs and growth. Capital markets funding the companies that are going to compete in the global marketplace, create jobs, prosperity for Americans. Why do we need good capital markets? To provide credit for families that need to buy homes or send their children to school, or automobiles or cars, or for retirement security on the investment side. Now, I know why Bob asked the question the way he did, because our financial markets and Wall Street failed us big time in 2007 and 2008. And there's been a lot of focus on that, and deservedly so. The mistakes, poor risk management, business practices, flawed business practices, abusive business practices. But you know, if we just leave it at that and only blame the banks, who deserve a lot of blame, we'll be right back here again. Because there's been much less talk about the flawed government policies that created this problem. And we as a country save too little, borrow too much. We as a nation and as a people. And of course we have, that is not inherent, that derives from policies that are flawed and encourage us to do that. Why did we have a housing bubble? We just stimulated the living daylights out of housing through a whole series of things, tax laws, Fannie, Freddie, FHA, and so on. So we need to deal with some of those things. We had a flawed regulatory system. It wasn't a matter of not enough regulation. We needed better regulation, but we had a system that was broke, just plain broke. Someone put it in place after the Great Depression, and so we had emergency powers to deal with banks, but no emergency authorities to deal with non-banks. So we need to learn our lesson, and the lesson to take away is not that capital markets are not worthwhile and don't provide social benefit. The lesson we need to take away from all of this is what mistakes were made so we can correct them. And that's one of the things we do in the United States of America. When there's a problem, we shine a light on it, then we move quickly to correct it, and we need to do that. Now, in terms of his first question on the TARP, this is something I've heard a lot, and let me be really clear what we were doing. The purpose of the TARP bank capital program in October, when we announced that program, and on a single day, we put capital in 9 big banks with over 50% of the deposits. And then in the days and weeks after that, We recapitalized many, many banks. These were non-failing banks. Most of them were healthy banks. And so the idea here was rather than nationalizing banks as they failed and putting all kinds of restrictions on them, was to get ahead, inject confidence, prevent a collapse, recapitalize the banking system. You could only do that if it was a voluntary program. So we needed to design a program that was going to be that was going to protect the government would get paid back, and the banks would voluntarily accept. Now, let me just really quickly put that in context for you. In early September, we had been forced to, in order to prevent a real calamity, come in and essentially nationalize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They had $5.4 trillion in securities outstanding. It would have been an incredible disaster if we hadn't to do that. We did that. We fired the CEOs. We wiped out the equity shareholders. This was a tough action. The following weekend, we had Lehman, Merrill Lynch, and AIG going down all at the same time. We tried very hard. We couldn't find powers that worked to save Lehman. There just weren't any. We tried. Merrill Lynch avoided failure because they were acquired by B of A. If B of A had acquired Lehman, it would have been worse because Merrill would have gone down, and they were bigger, and it would have been a worse situation. AIG was taken over, very tough terms. CEO was replaced. It was essentially nationalized. We then had to have Treasury guarantee $3.8 trillion of money markets to avoid an implosion. When we were up working to get TARP, WAMU had essentially failed and was acquired by JP Morgan. Wachovia was acquired while it was failing. Then after we had TARP, 6 European nations had come in and had to nationalize certain banks. So we made a judgment. We had to do something very dramatic and move quickly. And we were tired of dealing sequentially with one failing institution after another and dealing with it on an ad hoc basis. So we said, how do we do something that doesn't look like nationalization, doesn't have a taint to it, doesn't have government control? Let's design this security, non-voting preferreds, and I had hoped and expected we would get 2,000 to 3,000 banks to accept. But no sooner did we announce it, then critics like, people that asked the question and others immediately started pounding and saying, you know what, you can't let the banks get away with this, you gotta put restrictions, you gotta make them lend. You gotta make them lend more. We said more than what? More than, at the height of the bubble, more than they would have lent if they'd failed. How are we supposed to make them lend? You gotta make them lend. You gotta put this restriction, you gotta put that restriction. And as soon as that happened, the banks started to get concerned, and then Congress passed legislation to retroactively change the rules. So we had many banks that applied, had been approved and withdrew. Many others didn't apply. So rather than having 2,000 or 3,000 banks take capital, we had roughly 700. It worked. But they also rushed to pay back the government. Now, I look at it and say if 3,000 banks had taken capital and kept it for 3 to 5 years, that would have been more useful than any stimulus plan. But it's interesting to me always that the same people that stigmatized the program and criticized it and said you got to make the banks do this were the ones that caused the banks to pull back and regional banks not to take money are the ones that now say, hey, why didn't you give money to the regional banks? Okay, why didn't more banks take it? Why didn't they lend more? So that's a perspective. You can see I care a lot about it, but the one thing I've got to say, I was in a class and I tried to explain it, and the class didn't really understand. And when I left government, I thought the TARP was one of the most successful government programs of all time. I thought that, but a poll showed 92% of the American people were against the TARP and 60% were against torture. So what do I know? And I think the reason is we don't like bailouts or rescues. In our country, in the United States of America, when we believe that if people take risk, they can make money, but if they take risk and then the taxpayers got to bail them out and then they're going to pay bonuses, that's wrong. I think it's wrong. Everybody thinks that's wrong. I did things that were abhorrent to me, but I did it for the American people because can you imagine you saw what happened when Lehman went down? What would have happened if we'd had one of these big institutions go down? But I was never able to make that connection between Wall Street and Main Street. And so even though Bob asked two related questions, they're really one and the same. Because if you don't understand the role of markets and how important they are to Main Street, you're never going to understand why we had to do what we did. So on that note, and you can tell I don't care at all about this, right? You know.
I'm sure you would have gotten an A in Bob's class for that answer, by the way.
Let me tell you, Bob was a better student than I was. You know, we were there. And he was also a great public speaker, even in college, and he was a tremendous actor. He was a star in all the plays.